Hello and welcome to Regenerative Rising's podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. I am your host, Nisha Mary Poulose, Director of Regenerative Rising. And with me today is Tina Owens, Senior Fellow at Green America's Center for Sustainability Solutions, and she co-leads the Nutrient Density Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture. She also has her own regenerative farm, raising heritage pastured animals in Michigan, and her own consulting business, Snow Haven Regeneration. Tina is a trailblazer in the realm of food systems with over 20 plus years of experience at the forefront of regenerative business, sustainable sourcing, supply chain management, and financing. And she has a deep understanding of the linkages between soil and human health and the complexity of nutrient density in our food. She has also been at the epicenter of the transformation of the food industry with her roles at both Kellogg's and Danone. Tina is also a board member at Regenerative Rising, which makes this a really exciting conversation. And it's so wonderful to have you, Tina. And I've been in awe of you since we first met. And I'm so excited to talk about what you're doing. And there's so much to learn from you.
Oh, thank you, Nisha. And I'm so proud to have you joined as the new executive director of Regenerative Rising. So I have also been really looking forward to this conversation. Let's get started.
Yeah, awesome. Yes. So your work has been at the forefront of the regenerative transition. You know, you've seen the shift from various perspectives, from within the corporate structure and from outside, and now from a very mission centric from the movement perspective as well. So how about we start at a point of when I want to learn what are some of these key observations along your journey that has brought you to this point in the context of regeneration?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have a strong belief system in the regenerative ag movement as a somewhat interesting single solution to a lot of issues. And while it may not be perfect for everything, it certainly does check a lot of boxes as it relates to planetary health, soil health, human health, biodiversity above and below ground, and the potential for mitigating climate change. So it's rare to have something that checks so many boxes of need across the spectrum of human paradigms. But I'm super excited about where the regenerative movement is at in this moment, which we'll get into more, just how many people are at this table, how many different paradigms are being shifted into a regenerative perspective, and look forward to sharing a little bit more specifics with you as we go into this conversation.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good start point. I'm curious about the linkages between nutrient density and climate change, and how how the way we are producing food is really affecting nutrient density. Because then it comes down to the health of the self, which probably is a great way to get more people involved, because there's this active connection that is affecting you as an individual, your children, your family, and it's no more a problem that is happening somewhere else to somebody. So how does nutrient density fit into all of this? And you are an active part of the Nutrient Density Alliance. So I'd love to learn from what your experiences there have been like.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. So I first learned about nutrient density tied to regenerative agriculture in 2016 from Tim LaSalle, who's a leading regenerative ag and climate scientist at Chico State's regenerative school. And they actually coincidentally put out one of the most original regenerative definitions as we know it in the current regenerative spectrum. Leading to the core practices that are at the base of most of the regenerative definitions that we have in the marketplace today. So I started pressing my life around this idea of nutrient density in 2016, and I'm happy to see a lot of movement behind it in the recent, I would say, 12 months as it relates to moving it to the center of the regenerative movement. So what is true is that we have degraded our soils and the soil structures to the point where the plants are no longer able to take up the level of nutrients that they need and used to be able to take up in healthier soils, using the mycorrhizal fungal community as an interactive pathway with the plant in order to return nutrients to the plant that we then eat as food. What's interesting about nutrients is they're the taste creators within our food. So if you've ever had that strawberry that looks like it was going to taste perfectly, and then you tasted it, it tasted like cardboard, that is a strawberry that was not taking up all of the nutrients that your body actually expected to get from that strawberry. And what's interesting is this has happened writ large across our food system. So a lot of our foods are missing the critical nutrients that we need for standard human nutrition. And there's a lot of research that you can find as it relates to nutrient gaps and childbearing age, health of maternity, segments of our life, and then also early childhood and development as it relates to nutritional gaps. So we know what the missing part looks like and what it means in society. What we're learning now is how to bring it back into the existing agriculture systems where soil health is put central to the food system itself and not just treated as a medium by which we, stick stuff in and spray at the right things, and it gives us something we call food at the end, but actually returning food back into a system where the natural cycles are working to create the outcomes that our bodies have developed and expect from our food. And as you said, in the consumer mind, consumers are purchasing for health. There's a lot of data around this. There's a lot of data that they tie soil health with human health and better taste and better ecological outcomes. But we have yet to really solidify that in the broader consumer movement. Those are the first adopters, if you will. And so if I knew as a general shopper walking into the store that buying, regenerative product X versus standard product Y meant something for my own fertility, my own longevity, or my kids' ADHD, or even, satiety and how I actually manage my own hunger, I might make different choices fundamentally than what I might be doing today. And there's a lot of consumer products companies that say they're working in the regenerative space, but have yet to actually turn this lens towards showing the consumer what the benefit is for regenerative agriculture to them. And so I think that's a critical component that we need to bring back to life in the food system, is understanding the changing landscape of nutrition. I'll add one thing that is very noteworthy that needs to be understood in this moment. Molecular mapping of food is going to matter a lot in the next decade for nutrient density. And so for those who have not heard of this before, I want you to go back and think of the Human Genome Project, where we first mapped the DNA of humans, which cost $3 billion and took 13 years. Then we had the Human Microbiome Project, in which we learned we are more microbes than humans, which cost considerably less and went much faster, to now you can actually do some of those same tissue samples for $100 in a day. So now those tools are being turned on the world around us, including food. And there's a lot of notable efforts around food. And there are new topics coming up, like a term called nutritional dark matter, which is the biochemicals in food that we've never been able to map before, and that we're only learning what they mean for human health. And so there are a lot of researchers that are saying there are tens of thousands or even millions of biochemicals in food, potentially as it relates to what we would call nutrition. And the USDA tracks 150 of them. Ergo, we know less than 1% of what's in our food from a nutritional perspective. So we got to break what our faith is in nutrition of last century's knowledge of nutrition and actually move into a new paradigm that's at a molecular level mapped to what it means for our human health via AI. So there's some exciting developments that'll come out between now and 2030 on that, but I just wanted to, seed that in there, that there's a lot of new exciting work in nutrition to be brought to bear.
Yeah, that is exciting and very intriguing. So I'm wondering, because this is what occurred to me, how does a consumer really access and understand this information when you start mapping it at a molecular level? And how do we sort of deal with the information overload of it all? Because when there is a lot of information and people are not able to understand it easily, there's also a chance of like things getting twisted and like information being used in ways to promote some specific agendas, right? So to simplify it, what is also being done to or how do we prepare ourselves to this this incoming information? Like, how do we prepare ourselves to understand it and use it to our benefit?
That's a great question. And you're right. For consumers, having to understand what nutritional dark matter means, right? That's maybe they might understand that term, by some point later this decade, but really understanding what that means for human health is going to take some sort of translator. And fortunately, we're all carrying one around, right? So it's going to be about tying your food choices to things like your metabolic response through your wearables and having some level of red, yellow, green in your phone, helping you understand what it means for your human health. So imagine if your wearable is tracking your metabolic response and you ate a Snickers bar this morning, sorry, Snickers, and you're having some sort of response to it that's actually not good for you, and you're able to get a signal from your phone that's tracking your response and shares with you that, maybe you should consider a different way of consuming that or smaller portions or something. But if it's tracking everything that you're eating, and let's say you're not getting enough magnesium in your diet, maybe you're not sleeping well, and maybe it knows that because it's already tracking the rate at which you're sleeping deeply. And so it would tell you, hey, you've been eating this way for 6 weeks. Maybe you should adjust your eating because you're, not getting enough magnesium. It's leading to disrupted sleep. But if you eat this way for, 20, 30, 40 years, maybe it will end up leading to a systemic disease or, neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's or dementia. Or diabetes, or the lifestyle diseases that our individual choices in food are already driving us towards. There's a lot of research showing that if you can address it back at metabolic syndrome, that you can actually help people curb that before they end up with those full-blown conditions. And so nutrient density is going to be key in that conversation. And we're not the only ones taking a look at this. There's actually a very famous study going on right now with the Rockefeller Foundation and the American Heart Association called the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. And they are mapping the top 1,000 foods on the planet at a molecular level, and then looking to understand what it means for human health. So if you go to their website and you go to their impact tab, it will tell you that they are working to understand childhood nutrition, personalized nutrition, what soil health means for nutrition, et cetera. And again, this is American Heart Association, which means that they're teaching you, consumers what to think about this. They're teaching doctors what to think about this. They're teaching the healthcare industry at large what to think about this. And so we won't be the only ones talking about this. There's a lot of different tech that goes into this, including things like mass spectrometry and the ability to scan food and understand immediately what's in it. And the nutritional levels. So our partner, the Bionutrient Foods Association, that's at the table for the Nutrient Density Alliance as a leader. They are working on nutrient variation, but they also have a biometer, a handheld mass spectrometer that scans food, is calibrated for 10 or more crops, and it tells you that food's nutrient density instantaneously. So a lot of that tech will end up entering this space for you to be able to scan your food. And last thing I'll say on this, Samsung actually has a patent for an embedded mass spectrometer within cell phones. So at some point in the future, we should see this be a part of how our tech is creating better outcomes in personal choice and in our daily lives. I'm conscious that my Zoom has fully disconnected because I have rural internet. And so while you have me by sound, you don't have me on the video at the moment, or if you do, it's a frozen version of me. So I'm going to rejoin. Let's hope it doesn't disrupt anything. But let's keep the conversation going. Where do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, your voice is really clear, so that's absolutely fine. We can continue. Yeah, so I think the beauty of this, which really stands out to me, is how how this really relates back to the individual and the distinct uniqueness of the individual, right? Like as a person who my reaction to say coconut oil versus olive oil would be different from somebody else's who probably grew up in the Mediterranean region. So I think that's very interesting because we're looking at very high level mapping, understanding of what each food contains and what can generally be good for people and what is generally bad, which I think is a lot more important in today's conversation because there's literally a lot of poison in our food. But mapping it back to the individual is really powerful. And because, as we were speaking earlier, it really boils down to the consumer. It really boils down to empowering and enabling and facilitating a world pretty much where every individual who is the consumer at the end of the day has the ability to ask for what they want and know what they want and are not just relying on what is trending or what is propaganda, but literally if you're able to track your own health and able to see and you're absolutely right? You can immediately feel like you eat too much sugar and there's a big difference between eating processed sugar and eating like natural sugar. Like if you have a full watermelon, you're not going to have an energy crash. Right. So that I find is really powerful. And that's again, some of your work, right? With Good Food Daily that you are again trying to engage consumers at a more powerful level and keep bringing this information out. So I just want to ask you a bit more about that. Like what are some of those key messages or key information that somebody should really be looking out for in terms of being able to make choices for themselves?
Yeah, well, and thanks for bringing up Good Food Daily, which is an initiative that I'm part of as head of product, which is looking to engage consumers through the media landscape and help influence them about regenerative agriculture in a positive way. So what's happening in the regenerative movement is you have $1 trillion worth of companies. That's just the largest 100 food companies. 58 of them have said they're doing something around regenerative. And so if you add all of those up, just from a sales revenue perspective, you're already over $1 trillion. So you're not a fringe movement at all. Regenerative is a fully mainstream movement. And anyone who wants to see the data behind that is able to go to my website, Snowhaven Regeneration, and see that for themselves if they want to take a look. But what that means is you've got all these different voices entering the system of stating what regenerative means for them. And there are those 4 key practices: cover crop rotation, no and no-till, and animal integration, animal or manure integration, that tend to be at the base of everybody's regenerative program. So people who feel like everybody's flying by night and all the definitions are different, there's a base structure there that you can pull out in every single one of them. So let's feel a little less panicked about that part. This is how a movement gets started. Many, many voices come in the room. We even had this with the organic industry before regulations. There were 20 plus different states that had their own definition of organic and different percentages and different allowances, et cetera, before the 1990 Act to create the organic standard as we know it today, right? So let's remember that this is how a really meaningful movement comes to market. But what those $1 trillion worth of companies are doing is they're focused on their procurement strategy and their supply risk management and their greenhouse gas reporting and their farmer onboarding. Even though all of them are consumer-facing brands, they are not engaging the eaters on the demands that they have for products like this in the marketplace, or they're only doing it sporadically. So there's only a few products here and there in their portfolio that are talking directly to the consumer about what regen ag means in their food system. And so Good Food Daily is an effort with the founder and my partner, Sandy Itkoff, who is a leader in the documentary world, to help create some media solutions that help consumers move on the spectrum of understanding of the regenerative agriculture movement. So how do we make sure that the consumer demand comes into not just lift up the regenerative movement from a purchase and sales perspective, and then farmer demand, which is critically important, right? That we create a solid market and demand for farmers. but that we make sure Regen Ag stays in the market for the long haul. So what I'm worried about is if we're only looking at this through the lens of supply web development or procurement risk, et cetera, and we don't actually embed it in the consumer mindset, that there may be some people who treat it more as corporate flavor of the month. When what we actually need is for regen agriculture to be as infiltrated into the grocery store as things like the non-GMO project certification are. So non-GMO project certification is the single largest on-pack certification in the US outside of religious certifications like kosher and halal. And when you wind that back 15 years and realize they weren't there in the grocery store at all, and now they're in every single category, including health and beauty and personal care, right? We need that level of staying power with the regenerative movement, that it's overtaking every category, and that it's got meaningful measurements behind it, that consumers know that it's better for their health, that it's not just a corporate greenwashing where they're taking sustainability 2.0 and calling it regenerative. And so there's a couple different ways to create this level of accountability and demand. One would be in the Nutrient Density Alliance to see nutrient density as a central outcome of regenerative ag systems, because you tend to see positive lift on things like polyphenols, antioxidants, omega-3, 6 fatty acid ratios. The second would be to actually educate consumers on the movement writ large as it relates to their own personal health. So when you look at a lot of the consumer research around purchase behavior, especially as it relates to sustainability, you find that if you can focus it at people's core, where it's about what's within them rather than what you're pushing at them, that it's a whole different connotation, engagement, paradigm shift in their way of thinking. And regenerative agriculture, regenerative systems has that potential for consumers, but they're not getting that information yet from the brands or from the industry, because again, everybody's focused on supply and risk mitigation. And so we've got to start creating this umbrella effect, a halo and an umbrella of permission, that these things are both real and that they matter for individual health and choice at the grocery store. And so Good Food Daily is about ensuring that consumers are getting that information directly, and that they understand that these products are both good for them and good for the rest of the environment and movements that they would like to see, as opposed to it only being about them helping something outside of themselves, right? It's always something somewhere else that they're paying for, as opposed to, no, I'm paying for this for myself, and I also get all of these other benefits with it. So it's critical that we bring that into the mix.
Yeah, wonderful. Absolutely. I mean, it's really at a big part of the conversation about regeneration is about sort of reconnecting with yourself and understanding yourself and really taking care of your own well-being, because the environmental movement started in the early in its nascent years. It was very much about, let's do this for the planet, which then a lot of people didn't relate to. But right now we've come to a point where each individual is affected, each family is affected, whether you realize it or not, regardless of where in the world you are. And that can serve to really bring us all together in this way of understanding ourselves. And I really feel that that's a very important part of regeneration, because that's a good start point, because it also really relates to your sphere of influence now, which to me is like a great way to engage with really a mainstream audience who is busy with other things and, their survival, their own careers, their own families, whatever that focus may be. But everyone can still focus on the self. And when this clarity between what is good for the human body, what is working for human health, just directly and completely relates to what is health for the planet and what is the health of the soil, what is health of the air. And air quality is something that there's no more avoiding, right? Like, I mean, you step into bad air and you're immediately getting a respiratory response to it. And we don't need to go to that point for food. So hopefully we can start reversing and regenerating some of these things a little beforehand. And I want to continue one of those things that you mentioned, which is again a very interesting debate that I really see sort of the two conversations that is happening between, like, do we need standards and frameworks, and or is it just completely contextual? But whether we like it or not, the world that we're in is really kind of standard dependent, and we're really become a global economy itself, to speak, right? So but at the same time, regeneration is extremely contextual, and how is that reconciled? And I'm not, I'm not asking for some final answer, but it's something that I always try to find the kind of, what is that intersection between these two things, where you do need some standards, but at the same time, it needs to be contextual, and especially when we're talking about global food supply webs and supply chains as it used to be, but that is also a transformation. But how does one work with that?
Yeah, well, and you had mentioned something you had mentioned right before the question was what I would call the hope and optimism of the regenerative ag movement. So I just wanted to share that before jumping into the standardization. And standardization can be part of this, generating products that, yes, they're good for self, but they also bring the hope and optimism that you're doing the right thing all across the value of what you're purchasing. Standards, they are part of that simplification that we need as really busy consumers, especially, if you're in early parenting years and you're getting maybe only a few hours of sleep a night, and you want to know that you're feeding your children something that's really good, right? I look at the millennial movement here in the US, and when they became parents, they started over-indexing on organic purchases because they were buying them for their children. And then after they were feeding them to their children, they were realizing, well, why am I not eating this way, but I'm feeding my child that way because I know they need it. And then they switch themselves into that paradigm of, purchasing something that's more in the natural and organic spectrum. That paradigm shift, you have to have something to latch onto to research, right? No one has time to go out and research every single brand that's in the regenerative movement. Well, except maybe me, because I'm considering it my job. But to be able to have that shorthand in the grocery store as you're trying to make a decision about which barbecue sauce is best for your family, right? You're standing in the US, you're standing in front of a category that has 50 or more offerings that are of all different shades and stripes, right? And so looking for that shorthand on the side of a product or in an app that's telling you which of these things is matching the values that you want, I think is critically important. And you've seen some retailers that have started weaving their offerings around this. The Thrive Market is a membership-related delivery service that allows you to sort on things like fair trade certified or gluten-free or organic or regenerative. And so, it's important for consumers that want to be able to access the movement, to know what the movement means. And now that said, there's a whole spectrum of folks across the regenerative movement that we need to build on. You have the Regenerative Organic Alliance, which was one of the first certifications to enter this space, along with the Savory Institute and the Land to Market certification, both of which are critically important. They've helped pave the way on what certification means in the regenerative movement. But for example, in the US, less than 1% of land is organic. And so if organic is the entry point for that regenerative certification here in the US, that leaves the mainstream market needing a different solution. And where we need the most shift is in the mainstream market writ large. Now, we also need our gold standards and our North Stars to be able to look at and that help pull the whole system forward, right? So the certifications I've mentioned definitely play a thought leadership role that is absolutely critical and needed, because they show us what the best outcomes could be in the system. And they also take into consideration the social elements like fair wages, animal welfare, in addition to soil health and regenerative practices. And we need people to have that full spectrum, that full paradigm view of where a food system could be operating, as opposed to, I would say, the opposite of that, a heavily commoditized, decentralized, black box that's going into a central location and coming out as a processed food system, which is, not inherently bad, but has unfortunately created some really bad side effects, like going for quantity as opposed to quality, which has landed us where we are currently in the gaps in nutrient density and a degenerative farming system, where some of the science that we needed to help explain some of the things that we've been watching for the last few decades has really caught up and has started showing overwhelmingly that we need to bring life back into the soil, biodiversity above and below ground, right? All of these things. But I view the lens of certification as being critical, necessary, concretely must have this. And, for those who aren't sure which certifications to choose, it depends on where you're headed in the system. So if you're going to Whole Foods, they have a list of which certifications they'll accept for you to use the word regenerative on pack. That's pretty clear if you want to do business there. If you want to do business in the mainstream, it may be enough to have, some technical assistance in soil sampling and adhering to those 4 principles that I mentioned earlier, and to be meeting what we would call the basics of regenerative agriculture. We need people operating in the basics to move along the paradigm, because what ends up happening is they get introduced to the natural systems, again, of soil and agriculture in a way that changes their thinking on an ongoing basis. So, for example, there's a farmer that is part of the Green America Network who has spoken at the network meeting several times, who is saving a significant amount of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars per year on inputs that he no longer has to put on his fields. Well, after a decade or so of doing this, he realized, I'm basically farming organically, but I'm not taking the credit for it. I'm not going for certification in organic. Maybe I should. And so he did, because then he's getting the premium from the system. But his thought process was so focused on repairing the natural systems and cycles on his land that it was the outcome you should see in the system, as opposed to the certification and the premium. And oh my goodness, what I love for all of the farmers that I live around, my family, I'm from a multi-generational conventional farming and dairy family, the chop down every tree and plow every field variety. Unfortunately, I'm the black sheep. But to have, to see a spectrum change from just standard corn, soy, wheat rotation in the US to actually thinking of their land in a regenerative way, where the mind has been regenerated, that's the part that we really have to undertake, is that thought process. And so if it takes those first 4 practices to get people on that spectrum, and then we start moving them forward by showing them what's possible, that's where I get very hopeful. Certification helps, but if you're going to sell into a system, you really should have somebody looking over your shoulder to validate the claims that you're making, so that we all can have faith in the regenerative system. That's where I'm at.
Well, yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, actually. The importance of really creating this systemic shift, and in a system that has it's so pervasive right now, this degenerative system, and it's so confusing. And the interesting thing about the paradigm shift, as you were speaking, what I was thinking of was, I think the paradigm shift, the wonderful part is that the certification is now for the consumers. I don't know what happened to the light. It's for the consumer's benefit, is to simplify life for the consumer. And as opposed to working with giving over a lot of certification and a lot of limitations to the farmer. So this paradigm shift allows for regeneration to be contextual and to be really rooted to the land as far as production goes. But then for the consumer, you're not You're not flooding the person with information that is
Right.
serves to confuse, but rather simplify and say, okay, on this spectrum of this health, which gives, speaking of well-being and health, this is where you're at if you buy this product, and you are able to understand it in a minute or a second, and it also enables you to make smarter choices.
Yeah, and even though we have a farm here and we sell directly to former colleagues of mine, to family members, to neighbors, they know the farmer, they know it's us. It's not always possible to buy from a farmer that and we live rurally, where it's not always possible for me to make it to the local farmers market, and then my local farmers market happens to contain more arts and crafts or maybe bottled honey than actual crops that are grown. And, so it doesn't really hold a lot of pull for me to make it over there. And yet I would purchase that way if I had the chance. Instead, I'm shopping in the largest organic retailer, Costco, and at some of the other regional grocers that I have around me, especially the health food stores, to try and create the demand there for the products that I'd like to see in the system. But certification is how I came to my own understanding of the food system and the values that are within the organic movement, within the non-GMO movement, and then eventually in the regenerative movement once they started really diving into it in 2016. So yeah, I think while we would like to see regional regenerative food systems, the centralization of how those things actually get delivered to us in the US at least is probably here to stay. And so that shorthand for consumers is a critical, important way of communicating what's happening.
So I just want to take a minute and say that you are tuned in to Regenerative Rising's podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. I am your host, Nisha Mary Poulose. And with me today is Tina Owens, Senior Fellow at Green America's Center for Sustainability Solutions, and she co-leads the Nutrient Density Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture. She also has her own regenerative farm, raising heritage pastured animals in Michigan, and her own consulting business, Snow Haven Regeneration. I want to speak a little bit about the complexity of the supply web in this same context of regeneration. And as you were saying, this central sort of controlled supply is here to stay. But then there is the grower, and then there's ingredients are coming from across the world. And you have worked with sourcing and supplying and making this transition into sustainability and regeneration for organizations that are within the food industry, so to speak. So I was wondering, where are we at today in terms of the challenges of sourcing regeneratively, and especially considering that ingredients are coming from across the world, from some really remote parts of the world, in fact?
Yeah, so I'm going to take an approach on this that may be different from where most people would respond. I have built supply webs it is my main role at Kellogg's and Kashi. So I did that for the better part of 2 decades. And then at Danone, I built regenerative finance for one of the first programs within big CPG as it relates to regenerative agriculture and the financing of on-farm transition. But what I've recently discovered, because I spent 2022 working with a climate scientist trying to reintroduce a native perennial grain back into the food system, is that even some of the processing capabilities that exist are so centralized that it's really difficult to even bring unique products back into the marketplace that are grown regeneratively. And so there are 2 different gaps in the system currently. One is the conversion of farms and helping them pay for any upfront costs they might incur in converting their operation to regenerative. And I don't want to make that seem like it's a small issue or anything. It's actually one of the critically important functions within farmer conversion, is having that assistance to be able to convert, because technical assistance and other things are needed up front to help them understand. But beyond that, on ingredients that may not have a robust supply chain that's developed, or that maybe don't have the ability to segregate the regenerative product that they're making because you can't get the efficiencies of scale in the rest of processing, there's a lot of work to be done. So when I was working on this native perennial grain last year, we found it quite difficult to find cleaners and millers that were willing to deal with a grain of that size, which means that all the other perennial grains, grasses or legumes that we were working and bringing into the system, they have a different profile than what's currently being run in the system. Even though they could be technically planted and used as food and generate ecosystem services credits and maybe take some products that are currently annuals today and move them into a perennial system. So for example, the perennial rye was planted once every 7 to 12 years, as opposed to, replanting rye every year. And so, there's a manufacturing side of this. If you are doing the manufacturing side, like for example, there's a large meat company that has products in market that are regenerative, but it's not using the whole animal. And so those other cuts of the animal then end up going into conventional systems or even into pet food. And those are higher quality products in some cases than even what's going into hospital meal service or what we call Meals on Wheels here in the US, where you're feeding meals to people that are in need. And so we've got such an efficient system at a massive commoditized scale that some of these operations that are coming in, even with some, good volume behind them, still have challenges in getting to the same level of efficiency as the existing system. And so then it ends up feeling elitist, because then you have the people who can pay the premium that covers the rest of the animal or the rest of that supply web cost, because you weren't able to maximize efficiency for line utilization, fixed assets, overhead, everything that comes with owning a production facility. So it's important that we understand that even in the start of a movement, if it comes with a premium and it feels elitist and only people with certain funds are able to pay for it, it's those folks that are helping it get to the point where the cost can come down. So, at one point in the organic movement, I remember paying $7 for one head of cauliflower because it was certified organic. And I felt slightly ill at the time, but I was like, I'm going to do it anyway because I could afford to pay the $7 for the head of cauliflower. And then the more I thought about it, it's been years now, and I still remember this purchase clearly. But I've been, chewing on it ever since. And I'm like, those of us who can afford to help the system get started, even if we're just doing our consumer part to pay that premium, should be doing that so that it can get to a point of efficiency. So for example, in the organic movement, a lot of the original extra costs for organic were in the fact that you had to carve out time on an existing conventional production line. You had to do an organic clean. You had to let the line rest. And then you had to put through your product in, a day or two, and then have the line go back to being conventional. Well, all of those fixed overheads that are associated with that production line weren't able to be used as efficiently. And so it passed on a premium to the consumer. And many times what happened with organic getting lower cost is that the volume got to the point where it was efficient enough for it to have its own allocated production lines or resources, which then takes out those extra costs that really nobody's getting except, in the production system. And it's going to a cost that go out of the cost of doing the product, as opposed to somebody getting it as a profit, right? It doesn't add to a margin. It's a pass through. So being able to actually put that on a production line that's running solely organic or solely non-GMO or solely regenerative is a massive leap forward, but you've got to have the volume to be able to do that. And only when you do that will you see the efficiencies that we're used to experiencing on the rest of our ultra cheap food system, in relation to the percentage of wage that it takes here in the US. So sorry, that was kind of a long and trailing way of backing into the answer for your question, but does that make sense in the scope of what you were asking?
Yeah. I mean, so at the end of, I agree that there is a lot of value in embracing the fact that this is a process that we can't just overnight become regenerative. How much ever you can't snap your fingers and just change the system. And while we're changing the system, we need to be patient and forgiving and accept the things that are possibly limitations, and then understand that it's part of the larger process. So yeah, absolutely. It answers the question of like, where is it all coming from, which is really a big part of the movement as well. And I think just the fact that that question can be dealt with is important, that that we're thinking about it at every level, that where is it coming from? And then this is and even in regeneration itself is a process, right? It is part of it. There's no, I can't imagine this, oh, okay, this point where like, okay, we're regenerative, we can stop now. There is never going to be that point. The point of regeneration is that it's a process and it's not an end goal. So that's really valuable. And to speak a little bit more about the cost component, and you know, I mean, I know I'm like, we're going through a lot of topics, and that's really because you've done so much. And I want to talk about that a little bit as well, how interdisciplinary your career is and how it has all come together into Snow Haven Regeneration. But before that, I just want to ask, there's so many new different alternative funding mechanisms available. How is that influencing the ability to manage costs and sort of enable a more affordable regenerative kind of pricing for food products that are available?
Yeah, well, and it's worth saying that in many cases, once a farm is on the regenerative spectrum, that they're actually removing costs of inputs and other systems that they've been taught to use as part of propping up their dirt as they move back to soil, and it actually having the life that's meant to be within the soil. A lot of them are seeing cost reductions, and I've actually spent a lot of time, or have made sure to track every single time I've ever come across a validated resource on farmer cost reduction to show that the profitability is there. And it's also something I've got on my consulting website for anybody to access. So there's the funding aspect. There's a lot of capital investment that's going into regenerative conversion. In many cases, it might be because you're part of a corporate supply web and you're being asked to do this, hopefully with some of the climate smart commodities grants that just went out from the USDA to some of the larger players that are operating in the regenerative space and have very big commitments around acres. What we still need to fix, though, from a policy perspective, is things like farmers planting cover crops, not negating something like crop insurance, or using no-till and not negating crop insurance. So, there's some state-by-state policy aspects that still need to be dealt with. Hopefully those could be dealt with in, the Farm Bill of 2023 or beyond, but very close in to not penalize farmers for moving into those systems that actually lower the risks for their operations and that help restart the life within their soil. There's been a couple different ways that I've helped cover costs in the past for farmers. So let's start at Kashi. This one's actually an organic example, but it works really well on how that consumer component can come in. So in 2014 and 2015, Kashi undertook a program called Certified Transitional, which was about paying farmers that were in that 3-year process of converting from conventional to organic agriculture. And we did that with QAI as a third-party certifier. So we've got the certification aspect in there with third-party validation. And we made consumer-facing products, like a cereal, a shredded wheat, that was specifically from farmers that were in the process of transitioning. And this product was so successful that it created a halo effect for the rest of the portfolio. And we saw significant high single-digit growth in the natural and organic channel the year after we launched this because of the values reset. And because we were moving the needle on organic agriculture and conversion in the U.S., which again is less than 1% of farmland in the U.S. And so I was creating supply webs out of thin air in conjunction with the food scientists. So having to meet their margin, having to meet their nutrition needs, and ended up building transitional supply web programs around 6 different farms. Well, under my watch, we returned $2.5 million in profitability to those farms that otherwise they would not have gotten. And it was because the consumer responded to the program itself and were activists in purchasing the product. And then I was making sure that that premium was going all the way back to the farmer through a series of audits. And we converted under my watch almost 10,000 acres from conventional to organic practices. And so, once an acre is organic, it's highly likely to remain organic because of the premium that comes in and the fact that the farmers could choose what they wanted to grow on that organic acre after that. If they wanted to get away from growing organic wheat or sorghum or, whatever we had helped them convert to, they could take that and plant anything they wanted to for the best organic premium for their farm in order to help with overall farm profitability. So that created an awareness for me of where the consumer can be the activist and the catalyst in this to create that demand for farmers to feel supported and help convert. That rising tide lifts all boats. Then at Danone North America, I got asked to create a regenerative finance program and ended up with about $4 million in USDA grants, a couple $1 million in philanthropic grants, and the impact investing capital of tens of millions of dollars in access for farmers to get loans that were at or below market rate to help them convert. And so my hope was 60 to 80% of anything that a farm would have to spend, we actually had covered in the grants. And then they would, if they had to get a loan, they didn't have to walk into their local compeer agent, their local lender, and convince them what regenerative agriculture was, or why they needed to buy a roller crimper, or why they needed cash flow for cover crops, right? All of these things that at the time were very cutting edge. This is back in 2018. And so, there was the right rising tide there of capital that met our need, and it's continued to grow since then. You have organizations like Mad Capital that's doing a lot of work in this space, Replant Capital, Providence Capital. There's just a whole mission-driven finance. There's just a lot of different places that you could go. And David Luzax has written very well about all the different components of capital that can be found now in the regenerative movement and where their focus is. So funding is a great enabler, right? But also there's, scientists out there that insist that there's farmers that don't really need to pay that much to convert. It's more about being able to know which cover crops to grow on your land to start that process of transition. But if you want to measurably prove that you've done something, you should probably do soil sampling and measure the conversion over the course of a couple of seasons and beyond, to show that meaningful change has been made, again, to buffer against, kind of a corporate greenwashing approach where they might be using sustainability practice, not regenerative practices, just sustainability 2.0 and calling it regenerative, which we definitely want to buffer against in the system so that it doesn't get undercut from a transparency, truthfulness, and trust perspective as we look to really embed it within the full food system. So I've been fortunate to see some systems that really worked in helping move the needle for farmers and creating that base. I'm really hoping that in the Farm Bill for 2023, that there's a lot more support for individual farmers to undertake this on their own, especially for young farmers who want to come back to the farm. In the 2017 census in the US, I think it was over 50% of farmers the age of like 6. And it's going to be worse this time around because it was 8%, I think, of farmers that were 35 or less that had joined the food system. And so we have farmers that are literally going till they can't go anymore in the system, aging out, if you will, and not enough farmers backfilling them. And those farmers that want to backfill are the young ones who want to do things like organic or regenerative and use these different systems. They really need the funding. They don't have all of that equity that's been built up over generations, over decades, like their grandfathers had. And so we really need to see a lot more support in the system focused right specifically in that area and undoing some of the previous wrongs that were done in funding in the US, including, access to capital for Black farmers, for the indigenous communities, for people of color writ large, for urban farming, for some of these alternative systems that are really about centralizing food within the community again, which leads to better regional and regenerative systems. So I'm hopeful to see a whole lot more of that in the rest of this decade.
Yeah, that's exciting to see that other supporting and enabling mechanisms, including funding, are also transitioning. And what we're really sort of hoping for and working towards is a very supportive regenerative movement that is very collaborative and very unified in terms of the goal, in terms of where we want to be and how we can enable each other. And that's really just, well, it gives a lot of hope to start with, but it's also really to see the system in action, and it's really inspiring. And speaking of inspiring, I'm just really the interdisciplinarity with which, I mean, your expertise in so many different sort of topics related to the realm of regeneration and food systems is really fascinating. And if we relate it back to the idea of complexity, the idea of having to that it's not one thing and one solution, and like putting blinders on and solving problems and creating more problems in the process, right? And that's essentially a big part of the shift, the paradigm shift, that to understand that every action has a ripple effect, and it could be a very positive ripple effect or a very negative ripple effect. And the idea is to create that nexus of solutions solving other problems rather than creating more problems. And so how do you keep this messaging really integrated into your own process of consulting, and that, you know, and that I see that that's really what Snow Haven Regeneration really comes to, because it's all of this expertise that you have built over the last 20 and more years. And how does that really help with the current scenario? Like, how do you put that out into the world?
Yeah, well, I would say I've learned a lot from all the expertise around me. And so in many cases, it's me sharing information that I've learned over the last few years with a lot of others, going back to 2016 and when I did the first soil health program for Bolivian quinoa growers in Kashi. And so I've been learning since that time. When I joined, so you mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of Regenerative Rising. Elaine Diaris, who founded Regenerative Rising and was the previous executive director, has done a whole lot to engage the spectrum of voices across the regenerative community in a way that it became a cohesive constellation of experts to listen to. And so I've been very fortunate to be guided by her. And I know you're taking that role on this year and bringing us all back together post-COVID to have those wonderful, deep, connecting conversations that really matter and are not at a capitalist level, but actually are at the humanistic and social and spiritual level that need to be engaged for this work to be truly sustaining. I've had wonderful mentors throughout my work career that have helped engage me in the scientific studies that they've been involved in and helped me understand what it means for the work that I had at hand. And I think I was very fortunate to start off at Kellogg's working in research and development with food scientists for the first 5 years of my career in the food system. And, they were from all continents except Antarctica, right? So I was working with people from all over the world with very global views about food and helping them manage their innovation projects from a global sourcing perspective. And so I think that open innovation, that open mindset, that collaborative spirit, knowing that each one holds a certain piece, and that holding that piece up high and calling yourself an expert and leaving everybody else out is not the right approach to take. It's all a family, a unit, a community of voices brought together, and inviting people to bring their expertise to the table, recognizing other people for their expertise, not just taking it and running with it and trying to do something on my own, right? But actually trying to be part of a bigger collaborative, communal, collective is the most important thing we can do as experts in this field. So if I was only working in corporate sustainability reporting, I would have a very limited view of what I needed to do each day. If I was only working in procurement sourcing, or if I was only working as a food scientist on creating the next product, I might have a very limited view of what I needed to do. But when I reach beyond what my role requires to understand that the way I source those ingredients really matters for things like nutrient density or human health, the way that I create a recipe and put all those ingredients together can have a meaningful impact on the land, on the farmer, on the child that eats it. If I really understand that sustainability reporting can come with a regenerative mindset, that means that I'm pulling the company culture forward in understanding more about this new food system paradigm and not just yesterday's metrics on, what it means to be a good light bulb changer. Instead, moving to true, dynamically, fully integrated regenerative systems within food companies, that requires a different mindset. And so having that modeled, being around people like yourself and Selene, our broader board, Mad Agriculture, we've got Clarenda Stanley on our board who's living this as well as a farmer with a brand, Green Heffa Farms, right? And bringing this to life, showing people the whole spectrum of what needs to be solved. We need a lot more folks who are looking up from their own part of the system and not just checking the 3 or so boxes they have to check to get their raise and bonus for the year, but actually looking at what their own part is. I happen to believe, coming from the CPG world, that folks in those positions are in some of the most privileged positions you could be in to have decision making in this moment, given that agriculture has such a massive footprint in the health of our human populace and in addressing climate change. And so for me, it's always been, how many different puzzle pieces can I put together? How many different people can I help connect to one another in order to lift the whole system, not just my tiny little piece that I'm going to get paid better for at the end of the year, right? Because at the end of the day, I might get a really good paycheck up until, 10 or 15 years from now, when the whole system starts collapsing because of unmitigated climate change. And then suddenly I won't know what to do with myself, or I could work backward from that point and start creating really deeply meaningful change in all parts of the system, wherever I can, today. So we haven't gotten to it as a topic, but one of the areas where I'm doing that is the life cycle assessment process, which I went through a process this last year with the perennial grain that I was working on, and discovered that not only are perennials not taken into account for soil carbon sequestration without paying extra and doing a whole outside process, but organics themselves are not set up for success within the existing life cycle assessment framework. There is no central cache of organic LCAs. They remove a couple of data points from the conventional system and call it good. Well, that means that if you were to take all of the existing data on life cycle assessments and greenhouse gas emissions and feed it into something like AI and ask it to make a decision, you would be leaving out regenerative, perennials, organics, and indigenous managed lands, which, by the way, when you add all 4 of those categories up, you're talking more than 50% of the food system. And oh, by the way, it's the 50% of the food system we actually need for human health, longevity, generational health in the future, climate change mitigation, soil carbon building, all of it, water cycles, everything. And once I learned this, I couldn't unlearn it. There was something I had to do about it. And so fortunately, I had all of the right peers, friends, connections in the food system to have this conversation when we created a roundtable to talk about this issue, going beyond that organic, conventional, those old tensions, and saying, well, within the conventional food system, you're talking things like viticulture, wine, you're talking almonds, you're talking ocean spray cranberries, you're talking Driscoll's blueberries and raspberries. Those things are not being given the credit that they deserve in the existing LCA structure and greenhouse gas reporting, because the methodologies have not been refined to the level that chemical agriculture has refined them. And by the way, that means we're leaving out a whole viewpoint in what we would currently call empirical data. That has to be fixed. With the greenhouse gas mandatory reporting structures that are coming in place between now and 2030, it puts those systems at a disadvantage that is utterly unacceptable in this moment, because we need these systems so badly. So, it was finding out that type of problem and not being like, oh, well, shoot, nobody's going to pay me to do this, or it's not part of my job, so I guess I won't do anything. When in fact, I was sitting here with all the connections, all of the people to talk to, all the people to bring together in order to ask this question and start elevating it on the global sphere, so that life cycle assessment methodology writ large could be looked at to include things like the regenerative movement. I mean, imagine Cargill and their 10 million acres, or Nestle and their 14 million tons, or Pepsi and their 7 million acres, or General Mills and their 1 million acres, all these commitments they have around regenerative agriculture. And at the end of the day, the life cycle assessment methodology doesn't take into account the positive outcomes of the systems change that they just did, without having to have some sort of extra design outside of it. The standard everyday process does not understand that a GMO beet sugar and high annual tillage should not have the same starting point as a date palm that's planted once every 2 to 3 decades, requires almost no inputs, and also gives you sugar. These two things are not the same, but they're treated as though they're the same. And there's chemicals on the field, there's the harvesting process, and then there's all the manufacturing and storage and the consumer stream of where it goes and ends in the life cycle. But there's no acknowledgement of everything that comes before that, for biodiversity above and below ground, for the carbon accrual, for the water cycle, for downstream effects, for nutrient density, and what we would probably consider true cost accounting outcomes and the benefits associated with those, right? None of that is taken into account. And so we're going to have to change that framework at a global level if we really want to do the right things as humans. But in your question about, paradigm shifts and bringing all these different viewpoints together, sometimes it takes 20 years of building all of those connections and relationships just so you can have that moment where you're like, oh, I see a problem. Do you also see this? What does it mean? How do we fix it together? And then have the courage to step into that space and try to make it right. So, yeah, that's what I'm working on over here. Wish me luck.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what really I'm sitting with listening to you is just how incredibly interconnected even knowledge systems can be within the self, right? And I think that's the 20 years and more than that, the mindset to want to do it is something that really gives hope that as people like you are able to step out of predefined boxes and comfort zones to explore more, learn more, and try making these connections for the self first, and then within the work paradigm as well, is really very powerful and very inspiring. And I would also, I'm really gathering a lot of hope out of this conversation, because if there's this great work going on at this level, which is often what people are sitting with and saying, oh, this is not in our control, but it could be. And this is the system change that we're working towards. And we're not just sitting back and saying, fine, we can't change anything. So that's really, really inspiring and powerful. We're almost at time. But I just want to ask you, what's next? Is there anything exciting for yourself or for the world from Snowhaven or any other part of your of the work that you're doing that you'd like to share?
Oh, so much exciting stuff. I think that you and I being at Expo this year, and I'm on a panel about nutrient density. It's the first panel on nutrient density tied to regenerative agriculture that's been had by New Hope at Expo West. So I'm really looking forward to integrating this further into the natural and organic community mindset. And there's a lot of regenerative brands there. I know you are also leading a panel at Expo West, and I'm very excited for your introduction to the natural and organic community, because Regenerative Rising has been such a beacon of hope, of community, of change, of supportive networks, of strategy, of what leadership looks like in this space. And we just have so much work to do. And I know it's going to be incredibly impactful with everybody back from COVID and really ready to dig into true meaningful change. And I know you and I are just going to have a great time working with our community there. So I'm really looking forward to that next, which is in about a month.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. I mean, I can't wait to have these conversations in real life, in real time, at Expo West, and also engage with a lot of our audience, who is actually part of this community of natural products and regeneration, and looking forward to really meeting a lot of people in person. And I just want to add that for Regenerative Rising, the board, and for me was really a very powerful experience to be in a meeting with so many incredible, grounded women who have really spread their wings, who really expanded beyond limitations. And to be in that meeting is just a very powerful experience. And so Celine, you and every other member of our women's board is a big part of what Regenerative Rising stands for, and what we hope to achieve in the coming years. And before we close, I just the last thing, is there a way that people can read more about you, or is there a website? Is there a way that they reach out to you?
Yeah, so there's snowhavenregeneration.com. Snowhaven is SNOWE because it's an anagram of my last name, OWENS. It's similar to the name of our farm in Michigan. I would also mention that we also have our big Regenerative Rising kickoff coming up with Awakening Audacity in April. So we'll have a lot of moments to be able to engage with the community and put the leadership to work of those of us around the table, with you directing us. And so it's going to be a really critical year, 2023. I can't wait to see what happens next. And I thank you for your time today, Nisha, to talk with you about these things.
Absolutely. Yeah, me too. It's really exciting for all that's coming up, and all that we're building towards with Expo West, with Awakening Audacity, and the other things that we're yet to announce and are working on. So I thank you so much, Tina. Thank you for your time. It's been an incredible conversation about so many things. I've learned so much. I have things to look up, and more things to also expand my own knowledge into. And it's just really it's really just incredible to know that there's this much work going on out there, and it's all interrelated, and it starts with the self, but it really is, there is a lot that we can do as individuals, whether it's making choices as a consumer, or whether it's stepping out of our limitations to really work towards changing the system, by even doing simple things like learning more about the system, and finding our true genius and working with that as a tool. So thank you so much for being on this podcast.
Yes, I can't say thank you enough. Good to see you again.
Yeah. So with that, this is Regenerative Rising's podcast, Elevating Stories, Activating Change. I am your host, Nisha Mary Poulose, Executive Director of Regenerative Rising. And with me today is Tina Owens, Senior Fellow at Green America's Center for Sustainability Solutions, and she co-leads the Nutrient Density Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture. She also has her own regenerative farm, raising heritage pastured animals in Michigan, and her own consulting business, Snowhaven Regeneration.